This week we're going to talk about the eightfold method of policy analysis. And so, if you watched the video from last week, you kind of got an understanding of public policy. And public policies aren't always perfect. As we know, there are laws and policies and things that were put in place on the local, state, and federal government that always needs to be analyzed for effectiveness. And sometimes it's not as effective. So that's where people like us come in, public administrators, policy policy analyzers, where we come in and we look at the policy to see whether or not it was effective for that particular community or the state or the federal government. I can give you an example. Let's say that you're living in a city and the town decides to try to reduce crime. And they said, you know what, hey, crime is somehow linked to alcoholism, so we're going to create this town as a dry town. No one's allowed to sell alcohol at all within this town. Well, let's say they did that for a year. Well, how do we know that it actually met the goal of reducing crime in that town? That's where policy analyzers come in. That's where public administrators come in. We have to really look at it and see, okay, was there even a linkage between alcohol and crime in the town? And when this whole, when it was established, this whole policy, which created a town where this didn't sell alcohol, did it actually reduce the crime in that town? You would look at the data. First you'd look at the data and you'd ask yourself, you'd see if from the date that during that entire year, if that policy was established, if crime reduced, if arrest reduced, if alcohol-related arrests reduced, those sorts of things. You could also kind of look at national surveys, different research that was taken, even research that you can conduct in the town to see if alcohol was tied to crime. And so that's the way that you really can analyze policies. You can look at it from a fiscal point of view. Did this policy cost the town anything? Did it hurt the local economy because the liquor stores had to leave? And so if liquor stores have to leave, they can't set up shop in the town, they have to leave, people lose jobs because some people may have been working at the liquor store. Maybe a liquor store was a major employer of that town, or maybe Walmart. Maybe you have a Walmart in that town. It's a small town. Maybe it's a small town. You have a Walmart there, and they can no longer sell any form of alcohol. So they have to lay off some people at that particular Walmart because they're not bringing in revenue from alcohol sales. So that's just a way that, this is some of the things that policy analyzers, public administrators think when they analyze policies, whether it's on the local level, state level, or federal level. Well, this week I want to go over something that you've been reading on. This week you should have been reading A Practical Guide for Policy Analysis, the Eightfold Path to More Effective Problem Solving. And that's by Eugene Barduck. And like I emailed you before, I believe last week or the week before, it doesn't matter what edition of this particular book that you get. Please, you should have bought the book. It's a great, what Eugene Barduck really looks at is a way to analyze policies, an eight-step method to analyze policies. And I just want us to go over it briefly. And so the first step you should have, if you read the book or you've done some more research on the eightfold method, the first step really is to define the problem. So the problem should discuss the undesired gap between as-is condition and to-be conditioned. And so the most important policy problems are ill-structured, wicked problems that are difficult to resolve. What are wicked problems? Wicked problems are problems that don't necessarily have a clear-cut solution. For example, one wicked problem that we could think about within society is the problem of drug use, drug addiction. And it's a wicked problem because it doesn't have an easy answer. Some people may say that drug addiction is tied to socioeconomic status. Well, how do you actually remedy someone in that particular who grew up in poverty? How do you keep someone who grew up in poverty away from drugs? And then, that brings on a bunch of other questions too. Is education a factor? Is crime around a particular area a factor? Those sorts of things. I mean, it's not there's no easy answer. It's not so easy to resolve. So it's important to note that if you misdiagnose the problem, the policy solution is probably going to fail. So if we look at drugs and we say, okay, the sole cause of drug addiction in society is, let's say, poverty. And, that's a broad term, poverty. Well, how do you define poverty? What does that mean? Well, we'll say that, people who grew up in single parent homes, making an income of $30,000 or less, a household income of $30,000 or less, are poor. And so it's likely to lead to drug addiction for some reason. And so then we create a policy where we're pretty much trying to make sure that people don't grow up in single parent homes. Well, what does that look like? Are we just going to yank kids away from their parents just because they're single parent and put them in foster care to say that we're reducing drug addiction? So it's very important to really define the problem. It's really important to define the problem, because if you don't define the problem, the policy solution isn't necessarily going to be a right fit for that particular problem. So the next step would be to assemble some evidence. So to communicate the problem to the audience, you need to be sure that there is evidence that the problem does indeed exist. Is there really a problem? So this evidence should be strong enough to make your audience care about the problem and want to read further about solutions to address the problem. So, basically gather as much research, data, evidence on that particular problem as you can to really find out, is it really a problem? So we know drug addiction is a problem in society. Opioid overdoses, all those sorts of things, in particular areas in the United States, it's a major problem. How do we know that? Because we collected data. The data, where do we collect data from? Hospitals, state and local county health departments collect data on drug overdoses in their particular county, drug addiction, those sorts of things within wherever they live. In some places in the U.S., opioids aren't necessarily a big problem. But if we looked at, let's say, there's a small town in West Virginia, let me use a real example, York, Pennsylvania. There's a big issue out there of opioid addiction and opioid use. So we look at that and we say, okay, hey, there's heavy opioid use being done in this town. Well, how do we know? Well, we collected data. But maybe 30 miles over to the next town, it's not an issue. Why? Because we collected data and the data does not show that there's a big issue. So the next step after that is to construct alternatives. So alternatives should be ways to address or eliminate the policy problem. So in constructing alternative, one can utilize several techniques. Copy an existing policy without modifications. You can copy an existing policy and modify it to fit your needs. You can build a policy utilizing generic tools, and you can also build a policy from scratch with creativity and brainstorming. So alternatives should be tightly linked to your problem definition, specific enough to be actionable, relevant to your client's resources, and materially different from one another. You should try to include at least 3 to 5 alternatives. At least one of these should be a do nothing option. So, you have 3 options, and you have option A, B, and C. And C may be just to not do anything, and that's fine too. So it's important not to just choose dummy alternatives or pick your favorite alternative, because this will disrupt the analysis validity and reliability. Number 4, select the evaluation criteria. So criterias are used to measure the outcomes and impact of each alternative. One thing that Barduk describes in his book is the mental standards for evaluating the results of action. So the criteria should be measurable and quantifiable. That's very important. So there are several ways that criteria commonly is utilized by policy analysts. Efficacy, I can never pronounce that word. Cost, equity, administrative feasibility, unintended consequences, sustainability, and political feasibility. So the criteria will enable you to evaluate each alternative across the same metrics in order to basically ultimately determine the best policy option. So criteria should be chosen based on outcomes and impacts policy leaders would like to see from a policy option. The fifth step is project the outcomes. So you need to project the outcomes. So evaluate each policy alternative based on the criteria. So sometimes this process will enable you to clearly eliminate policy alternatives that don't really produce your desired outcome or impact. But it's often difficult to pinpoint the most effective policy alternative from this process. So, that's a important step in terms of narrowing down what your options are going to be. Confront the trade-offs. So look at that. So as a clear policy winner, it's often not produced from the policy analysis that you chose. So it's important to look at trade-offs between the policy alternatives to identify the best alternatives. Because you may have a list of 2 or 3 policies and do nothing doesn't fit and the other 2 don't fit. So what's a trade-off? If you do one policy, will it affect another, vice versa? So ultimately, you should be able to produce 2 to 3 crystal clear sentences on what your clients, whether it's a local government, state government, federal government, gets and gives up from choosing a certain policy alternative. So not all policy alternatives are perfect. They're going to be pros and cons, basically. So it's important to know what those are. And then the 7th one is to actually make a decision. So choose a policy alternative based on your analysis. Again, not every policy alternative is going to be perfect. It's not. We know this well. Look at healthcare. We look at federal policy. Not all, with Obamacare, with the Affordable Care Act, or commonly known as Obamacare, is it perfect? Is it a perfect solution to the wicked problem of healthcare in this country, the cost of healthcare in this country? The cost of healthcare is a wicked problem. It's a complex problem, as many different stakeholders, many different factors. But was the Affordable Care Act a perfect solution? No. There are great things about it which solve the problem, but there are also some things about it which need some work, and that's where policy analysis comes in, where you're objectively looking at the policy, no matter what your political party is, no matter what your ideology is, you're looking at the policy objectively and seeing if it's really met the desired outcome and impact. So, but you have to make a decision. So you can't just let a problem linger. If a problem's there, you have to make a decision. And so in 2010, Obama and Congress made that decision to set this policy up. And so there were some trade-offs. One example, some people made over a certain amount of money ended up getting taxed more because of this particular policy. Well, no one likes to get taxed. Let's be honest. I mean, maybe you do, just like giving a ton of money to the government, to the federal government, but that was a trade-off. They had to say, okay, we want to provide health care, universal health care. We want to make steps towards universal health care. However, we're going to have to increase taxes. So that's definitely a trade-off. So finally, tell your story. So in recounting the process to the client, whether it's a local, state, or federal government, it's important to clearly tell the story. Trade detail for brevity. So you should consider 3 types of audiences. Those that will spend 30 seconds reading your analysis, those that will spend 3 minutes, and those that will spend 30 minutes. So kind of think of it that way, and that's like a good, rule of thumb when you're telling your story of the policy. So your analysis should provide enough information to satisfy all 3 types of readers and enable them to understand your process and ultimate recommendation. Bartek talks about the taxi driver. Basically your policy, if you're explaining your policy analysis should be so clear cut and, that even, and, really, comprehensible. your policy needs to be understood by even a taxi driver in New York City driving you through the city. It should not be super complex to where no one really understands the analysis or what you're saying. So really, you should be able to talk to the average person on the street and explain your policy analysis so that even they understand, even someone who's not in the field of public administration or government, or who really doesn't understand all of those nuances there, that they can understand the practicality behind your policy analysis. And that's one thing I love about Bardick's eightfold method is that it's so easy. You guys remember the Geico commercial? So easy a caveman can do it. It should be so easy that a caveman can understand. So please, and remember, this isn't just limited to government. I mean, you can also apply this policy method within nonprofit organizations, to some extent businesses as well. But for the focus of this class, within the context of this class, nonprofit organizations use this a lot too, because they set up policies within their government, within their organization, and if they're contracted out by the government to actually provide services to a particular local, state, or federal government, to the people, if they're contracted out by the government, they'll need to use this policy. They'll need to use this process to see if they're effective. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. Remember, do the discussion board and turn your evaluation proposal project to be approved. The instructions for that is on the syllabus. All right. Thank you.